Uh, okay, good. I'm glad everybody's here. Let me just turn on the recorder here. This is Rabbi Jeffrey Stacks of Atid and Web Yeshiva with another installment at the beginning of a new cycle of meetings on the topic of modern Jewish history, Jews, Judaism, and modernity. This semester, this Zman, during the fall of 2010, we will be turning our attention to Eastern Europe. Until now, we've spent quite a bit of time talking about developments in Western Europe at the advent of the modern era. If you're new to the class, or even if you're not, if you were previously registered, I think this is the third cycle of classes in this ongoing course of modern Jewish history. If you were registered previously, you can access all of the previous courses through the WebYeshiva archive, or you can access just the MP3s, just the audio recordings of past courses are archived as part of our partnership with WebYeshiva.org. I put that link up in the chat box, YU for Yeshiva University, WebYeshiva.org. If you'd like, you can look there. If you are interested in catching up on back courses, the one I would recommend was the very, very, very first session. If you go there, they have a very easy search feature. You can search under my name or under history. And all of the back courses in this series are there. Not all of the WebYeshiva courses are there. As part of our partnership with them, certain courses get uploaded, or at least the MP3s. You don't see the screen, you just hear the recording. But I would recommend there was a session there, and you can just easily search for it, called "What's Modern About Modern Jewish History." Maybe Alan, you can put up the link if you can find it while I'm talking. And that was an introductory session that was given a year ago already about the general question of what are the characteristics of modern Jewish history, and when does modern Jewish history begin? This question of periodization of when one period begins and another one ends, is a methodologically interesting one and an important one, because there's no one. Rarely is there ever just one moment in time that you can put a pin into and say this is the turning point. It's much more complex than that. But it just broke down neatly that last semester we discussed modern Jewish history largely in Western Europe. The advent of the Reform movement took a lot of our attention. The emancipation of the Jews in Western Europe. But now we turn to probably where a lot of us hail from, or at least our Bubbies and Zadis and Elta Zadis, where we come from, and that is Russia. Now, interestingly, we think of Russia, we think of the Pale of Settlement, and we'll get to all of those topics as we move along throughout the semester, and even tonight, just by way of introduction. But the truth is that until 1772, there were hardly any Jews in what we call Russia, or Mother Russia, not to be confused with what we used to call the Soviet Union, which included various buffer states between Russia proper and Western Europe. But in Russia proper, there were very few Jews to speak of in 1772. But Poland, and I'm sorry that our friend and Chavruta, let me just look, no, I'm sorry that our friend and Chavruta, Joel Nowicki, isn't online with us tonight, because he would be, if he was, he'd be joining us from Poland, and he'd be able to tell us, no doubt, what they must have learned about in elementary school up there in northern Poland. that Poland, the Kingdom of Poland, and actually I uploaded to our Shiur homepage various maps that oh, let me see if I can't pull one up as we speak even. Various maps that will be useful throughout the semester. But Poland, which once upon a time, the Kingdom of Poland, which constituted a much larger area than what we know today as Poland. Poland was partitioned, it was divvied up 3 times. In 1772, in 1793, and again in 1795. And essentially Poland was annexed, as it were, by Russia in different waves. And in 1772, with the first partition of Poland, and then in 93 and 95, there's this incorporation of almost 1 million Jews into Russia. In other words, by gobbling up parts of Poland, Russia inherited about 1 million Jews into Tsarist Russia. And this, million or so, obviously estimates vary, this 1 million or so Jews that are suddenly inherited by Tsarist Russia, they make up a very distinct class of people. They're a kind of middle class between the aristocracy and the landowners on one hand, and the masses of essentially enslaved peasants and serfs on the other. The Jews were neither these nor those, and that created this very interesting category of 1 million people that suddenly just show up in Tsarist Russia. Pardon me, I'm just going to pause for 1 second while I upload these 2 maps, which I apologize I neglected to do so before we started. Just give me 1 second while I do that. Talk amongst yourselves. Barbara, you write, Poland had invited the Jews. I remind you that last semester, I think last semester, the year before, we talked about, we read a little short piece by Agnon about how the Jews got to Poland. You can find that in the archives as well. Here's a map of the partitions of Poland. Again, this is on the Shiur's website. You can download it. If you want, you can download it and print it. It's much more be much more visible to you if you had it on your own computer. But you see that Poland was chopped up between Russia, Prussia, and Austria in 3 successive waves, and this whole area, where we all probably have some DNA that can be traced back to this cradle. This whole area here in the different shades of green were first moving from the east to the west. This whole area was taken over by Russia, and again, there are about 1 million Jews that live here in this area. Here's Vilna. Here's Minsk. Let's see what else is on this map. Okay, so that's a map. Then we have this series of other maps. This is a few pages of maps that are just good for use. One is generally the Jews of Russia, Pale of Settlement, which I'll come to in a bit, and the expansion of Jewish settlement in Russia outside of the Pale of Settlement. So you can download these and have them for your own reference as we move along. The Jews at the beginning of the 19th century, around the year 1800, the Jews were divided into they did different things. About a third of the Jews were involved in innkeeping. I'll come back to that in a second, exactly what that was. But think of every Hasidic story that it all involves the Jews going to some inn. So innkeeping, leases, serving as some kind of middleman between the landowners and the peasants, basically subleasing land or leasing land from the landowners and then subleasing it to peasants to farm out on and serving as a kind of middleman. I see Howard just uploaded a link to that recording of the intro overall session, so that's there for you in the chat. If you'd like, you can then download that. Jews were involved in trade. Another third were involved in trade. A certain amount of Jews were involved in crafts. These are about 15%. These are your shoemaker, your carpenter, things like that. And then there were a small amount of what we call religious officials. These must have been rabbis and shochtim and teachers. And in addition to the fact that about 20%, 21% had no fixed profession, which might simply mean we don't know what they did, 1%, merely 1% of the million Jews in Tsarist Russia at the beginning of the Jewish residency in Tsarist Russia, nearly 1% are involved in agriculture. That's a very, very, very small percentage. In whole numbers, it's the smallest you can be without being zero. And this is, of course, viewed as a problem because 1 million Jews is a lot of mouths to feed, and only 1% at a time when the average population, in a very large percentage, had to be involved in the production of food to keep everyone going. Only 1% of the Jews are involved in agriculture. Is a very serious problem, and it puts a burden on the rest of society to, feed these mouths. Now, Barbara asks the question: could they own land? Well, we're going to see about that question. Obviously, initially they could not, which, by the way, didn't mean that they couldn't be involved in agriculture, because the landowners, the aristocracy that had large swaths of land, would lease out properties to peasants, to farmers, to serfs. By serf, I don't mean the guy on the surfboard. By serf, of course, I'm talking about the category of serfdom, which, if you are unfamiliar with, I'm sure 3 seconds of looking for it on Wikipedia will give you more information than you need. An indentured class of peasants that were tied to the land and tied to the landowners. So even though Jews couldn't own land, neither could the serfs, but that didn't mean they weren't working in agriculture. The communities, the Jewish communities, interestingly, around the year 1800, there were again about 1 million Jews in Russia. Within 100 years, by 1900, there were 5 million Jews in Tsarist Russia. That's a phenomenal increase. It's a phenomenal increase. The communities come under debt, heavy debt, by being under the Russian rule. there was a large population growth, and there was very, very, very heavy taxes that the Jewish community was subject to. The Russian government let the Kahal, the organized Jewish community, continue to function, but it got very involved, sometimes with a very heavy hand, particularly, for example, in the case of the rising tensions between the Hasidim and the Misnagdim, between the students of the descendants of the Baal Shem Tov. By the time the Jews get into Russia, the Baal Shem Tov himself has died, but in the second, third, fourth generations of Hasidut, it's playing itself out now very much, very heavily in what's now technically part of Russia. And the battles, the internal battles between Hasidut and its opponents, the Misnagdim, which we've talked about in the past, the Russian government gets very much involved in that. Perhaps most famously by imprisoning the Baal HaTanya. Those of you amongst us with Chabad connections can tell us more about that. Although we're coming up on Chodesh Kislev, on New Test Kislev, maybe if that's a Tuesday night, we can have a Fabrang of sorts to discuss that. But in generally speaking, the Russian government initially maintains the status quo that the Jewish communities had under the Polish authorities before being absorbed into Russia. In 1791, under Catherine II, the Tsarina of Russia, Catherine II, in 1791, is a decree that confirms the Jews' right of residence in the areas taken from Poland, and certain areas that at the end of the 18th century Russia had taken over in its conquest of parts of what had been controlled by Turkey, along with large areas of the uninhabited areas near the Black Sea. Let me show you here on a map. Here's the Black Sea. Make this a drop smaller. One moment, let me get the map up here. Here's the Baltic Sea to the north. Here's the Black Sea to the south. Down here is what today is Turkey. So certain areas here at the end of the 1700s, Russia conquers from Turkey, but a lot of these areas are very sparsely populated. So the Russian government was happy to allow the Jews to settle in these areas that were not heavily populated, because they had an interest in getting bodies on the ground in order to maintain control over this vast territory. The government wants to colonize these places and keep a Russian foothold there. And that's essentially how this area, what's called the Pale of Settlement, Pale, P-A-L-E, not P-A-I-L. That's basically how the Pale of Settlement, this strip of land, it's a quite vast territory, becomes the home of Russian Jewry. And that's, again, essentially why almost all of us, unless there's, just from your names, I don't notice any Sephardim amongst us, but each of us can probably trace at least one grandparent or great-grandparent that comes from this area. There are about 25 different provinces in this Pale of Settlement. There's about 1 million square kilometers. The Pale of Jewish Settlement makes about 1 million square kilometers. That's about a little less than 300,000 square miles. The Jews only make up about 11% of the total population. But they are concentrated in certain areas so that the place takes on a certain Jewish flavor. The idea that the Jews should be restricted to this area in the Russian Empire is not wholly it's not anti-Semitic in the sense that it's only directed against the Jews. It was part of a general policy that most of the people in the Russian Empire were deprived of a kind of freedom of movement. People couldn't just settle wherever they wanted. You know, like, think of the United States. If you're a citizen of the United States is a very vast place. But there's nothing stopping you from moving from New Jersey to California, from California to Alaska, from Alaska to Florida. Within the United States, you have complete freedom of movement any place you want to go, any place you want to visit, any place you want to live, any place you want to buy a house. You're welcome to do that. In the Russian Empire, that wasn't the case, and it wasn't just the Jews alone that were restricted. Other ethnic groups were also restricted to various areas. And the fact that the Jews were restricted to this area on the western flank of what was the Russian Empire is not different than the fact that other groups were restricted to other areas throughout the empire, and that people didn't have the kind of freedom of movement that we're familiar with in the modern era. Why did the Russian authorities do this? So there might be a few different reasons. There probably was the main desire was probably to keep the Jews restricted to this western zone of new land that was acquired by Russia, to keep them out of Mother Russia. Mother Russia being the interior, the classical part. You see, Moscow is here, very far from where the Jews are. St. Petersburg, the winter capital, is up here to the north, far away from where the Pale of Settlement. I mean, if you've ever visited, let me just see what's okay. Rafael Yehoshaphat is listing us some footnotes here. If any of you have ever visited, has anybody ever visited Russia? By a show of hands, who's visited? No one? So I was once, quite a while ago, in 1992. I'm shocked to think how long ago that was. In 1992, I spent a month in Tallinn, Estonia, which I think is up here on the map, up there on the Baltic Sea. And we traveled by train throughout the Baltic states and to St. Petersburg, the overnight train to St. Peter. And you get this sense of just the massive territory that we're talking about. Belova mentions that she's originally from Moscow, so she can fill us in better than I. But when we talk about last semester, we talked about Napoleon's foolhardy attempt to conquer Russia and to wage a siege on Moscow. There's no way you could do it. There's no way they could keep their lines of supply open, particularly not in the winter. So this idea of keeping Mother Russia, the interior Russia, pure and free of Jews is one reason. by concentrating the Jews in this area, you eliminate any kind of economic competition between the Jews and whoever was filling that middleman role in interior Russia. And it also, again, encouraged settlement of anybody, of any warm body, in these areas that that were fairly desolate and which Moscow had a desire to see populated, colonized, so that they could keep their hands on it. Over time, the borders of the Pale are adjusted, but essentially it remains quite static throughout history. There might have also been a desire. There might have also been a desire to keep the Jews isolated from the general population back in interior Russia, out of the fear that Jews were somehow conduits to the liberalizing ideas of the French Revolution and of what was going on in Western Europe, and that there would be some danger by allowing free penetration of those kinds of ideas into the heartland. That's, of course, speculation. In 1861, Alexander II, I'm jumping ahead a bit, in 1861, Alexander II emancipated the serfs, but the Jews were still restricted to the Pale. But certain classes of Jews, depending upon how productive they were or how valuable they were, certain classes of Jews were granted the rights to settle outside of the Pale. So, for example, and we'll take a look at this in a moment, in 1859, merchants were able to pay a certain fee that allowed them to register with the guilds. In 1861, university graduates were allowed to settle outside of the Pale. In 1865, certain crafts that were deemed valuable were admitted. In 1879, if anybody that had medical training was allowed to settle outside of the Pale. And through these developments, Jews were able to expand eastward. I think this map, let me just reorient the page. There you go. Let me just make it bigger. Nope, that's no good. Here you go. This map shows the expansion of Jewish settlement outside of the Pale. The Pale, of course, is over here. And you can see by 1900, so within about 100 years, the expansion of Jewish settlement throughout the rest of imperial Russia. Again, if you download the maps, you can study them more carefully at home. These maps, these black and white maps, are taken from a very good atlas of Jewish history by Martin Gilbert, which I recommend. I see people are posting to the chat, their own biographies or their family's roots. We're having a little roots project here of where everyone's coming from. In the Pale, again, the Jews are a minority, but they're heavily concentrated in the cities, in the urban centers, places that are familiar to us, places like Warsaw, Odessa, Lodz, Vilna, Minsk, Bialystok, these names that are the, you know, the you know, the cradle of Jewish civilization, at least of Ashkenazic Jewish civilization. We have to be careful not to be too Ashkenazic centric, but these are the places that nurtured the great masses of Ashkenazi Jewry. In the Pale, of course, Yiddish is the language used almost exclusively. Most children, by children I mean most of the boy children, receive a cheder and then yeshiva education. Jewish literature, of course, flourished, Yiddish and Hebrew. Hasidut thrives in the Pale of settlement. The incredible rate of expansion of the Hasidic movement from the end of the 18th to the beginning of the 19th century happens in this incubator of the Pale of Jewish settlement. But the Pale also gives rise, in this incubator of modern Judaism, the Pale gives rise to all the modern movements, the Chibat Zion, modern Zionism of the Eastern variety, the Bund, Jewish socialism, all of these come out of the Pale. Ultimately, World War I and the revolutions in Russia deteriorate the Pale. The Pale is technically ended in 1917 with the rise of communism, but the Pale, of course, really ends only in Auschwitz. The Pale of Jewish settlement, although officially ended in 1917, is really destroyed in the Holocaust. Let me go back here. In here, the beginning of the 19th century. The beginning of the 19th century. Why is this all crooked? Okay. One of the really interesting characteristics of Russian history is that, unlike Western Europe, there was no organized protest against the Tsar. There was no revolution. There was no organized opposition, of course, until the 20th century. In all other places, starting with the Magna Carta in England, throughout the rest of Europe, the nobility acted to limit the power of the king. In Russia, the nobility never organized, and even when the Tsars tried to modernize the empire, industry, economy, to modernize the army and the military, they never act to change the role of the nobility. And because of that, there's this very long, static nature to Russian, to the role of the Tsar and to the passive role of the nobility. In the person of Dzержinski, Gavril Romanovich Dzержinski, who lives from 1743 to 1816. Here you have him. Dzержinski was a poet. If you look him up in the encyclopedia, he's mostly there described for his work as a man of letters. But he was also a statesman, and he was at a certain point the minister of justice in the court of the Tsar. He was sent in 1800 to investigate the Jewish question. In other words, after the final partition of Poland, after Russia inherits these million Jews that they're not certain what they should do with them, there they are contained in this swath of land, the Pale of Settlement. So back at the home front, they don't know exactly what to do with this million Jews. And Bergevin is sent to on a kind of fact-finding mission. And he's asked to make suggestions of what to do with them. He regards the Jews as suspect, as he thinks the Jews are kind of exploitative figure, but he reasons that since God didn't destroy the Jews, we should be tolerant of them as well. This reminds us of some of the things that we saw in Western Europe, Voltaire, for example, and other thinkers in Western Europe, a kind of paternalistic notion to how we should treat the Jews, that we have to kind of take care of the Jews in order to make them productive. Again, this notion of turning them into a productive component of society, merely from a purely economic standpoint, is the question that motivates most of European government. Hold on, I'm just looking at the chat for a second. Okay. Let's take a look. Let's take a look then at what Bergevin had to say. Bergevin makes a well, before that, there's this notion that in order to direct Jews to productive trade, they needed to be, just looking at what people are writing in the chat, yeah, by paternalistic meaning in the sense that we have to educate them. The Jews can't take care of themselves. They don't know what's best for themselves, and we have to instruct them. It's certainly condescending, but that's what I meant by paternalistic. Just to go back a second on this topic of innkeeping. Again, about a third of the Pale, of the total population, Jewish and non-Jewish, live in villages. 90% of them lease their land. They don't own the land, but they lease it from the landowners, from the government. The landowners would turn to the Jews, again as this kind of middle class, to manage the estate, so that the Jews might be managing many surrounding farms in the villages that are owned by the aristocracy, or that are owned by the government. They did this possibly because the Jew was sober. The serfs were very often drunk. That may be because instead of receiving their pay in liquor, pay in cash, they received their pay in liquor. And since the Jew was sober and might have had money managing experience, the landowners relied on the Jews to act as middlemen, to make collections, to keep an eye on what was going on. The workers and the serfs were paid in liquor coupons, which again strengthens the system. The peasant goes into debt for liquor, and then the Jew very often became a moneylender because in all cases people have a need for ready cash. The nobles, of course, were responsible for this terrible state of affairs, but the Jews are the ones that got blamed for it. And the government would blame the Jews for the peasant drunkenness, and the Jews became scapegoats to avoid blaming the nobles. In 1801, Alexander I becomes the Tsar, and he established a committee to study the proposals that Dujardin had made, and in 1804 he issues something called the Statute of 1804, the statute concerning the organization of the Jews. Rafael, I think you just posted a link to the book of maps that I described. Let me take a look. Yes, I think that's it. This is probably a later edition. I see. It's very expensive. It's $23. This is probably a more updated edition than the one that I copied out of. But this is the book. This document, I've mentioned this in the past. I'm Xeroxing this out of a book edited by Mendes Floor and Yehuda Reinhardt, The Jew in the Modern World, a documentary history. These are primary sources on topics in Jewish history. So I just thought to take a look quickly at this document. Before I do that, let me just look over something. See, we have a bunch of new people with us. Danielle Honigstein, Jana O'Keefe, Neil Friedman. Just do me a favor, in the chat, let us know where you're from. Danielle, where are you joining us from in Israel? Yerushalayim. Neil's in Toledo, Ohio. And John O'Keefe is in Greenville, North Carolina. Okay, three new people at least to this class. Maybe you're new to WebYeshiva altogether. Welcome. Welcome. This document, the Proclamation of Alexander I in 1804, which is also again called the Statute of 1804. It says the following, and again you can hear the condescending tone in it. Numerous complaints have been submitted to us regarding the abuse and exploitation of native farmers and laborers in the provinces in which the Jews are permitted to reside. All right, that's what we described. The following regulations are to accord both with our concern with the true happiness of the Jews. We know what's best for the Jews, and with the needs of the principal inhabitants of those provinces. The principal inhabitants. Right? In other words, the principle, not just because they're the majority of the population, obviously the Jews are the minority population in the Pale, but the principal inhabitants are the non-Jews. These same non-Jews which the Russian government had been taking advantage of for centuries. Okay. Number one, education and language. So first of all, there's a very liberalizing flavor to it. Jewish children may study in all the public schools, secondary schools, universities in Russia on equal terms with other children. Okay, so far so good. Sounds nice. Jewish pupils will neither be required to renounce their religion, nor will they be compelled to study subjects which are contrary to their religion. Also very nice. Sounds very liberal. You can go to school, but you don't have to study anything. You don't have to study Catholicism. You don't have to convert in order to go to school, which we've seen in the past, of course, was sometimes the case. However, if the Jews refuse, despite all these encouragements, to send their children to public schools, special schools must be built at their own expense. At their own expense. So Barbara points out, it sounds like an assimilation plan, and clearly it was. So if you don't send your kids to our schools, you have to establish your own schools at your own expense. And for this purpose, a special tax will be levied. At those schools, now you could say, well, the Jews already had their own schools. It was called the Cheder. But that's not what they have in mind. The study of either Polish, Russian, or German must be included in the curriculum. So you see that there's this already an attempt to get involved in the curriculum of what the Jews must study. So you either have to come to our schools or you have to make your own schools. But either way, this is what has to be. Studied. All the Jews residing in the Russian Empire, although free to use their native language in all their religious and domestic affairs, that is Yiddish, are obliged as of January 1807 to use the Russian, Polish, or German language in all public documents, contracts, and bills of sale. Otherwise, these documents will not be registered. So this attempt to get rid of Yiddish. In accordance with these regulations, Jews who are elected as members of the municipal council in their former Polish province, again in the Pale of Settlement, shall, for the sake of order and uniformity, dress in the Russian or Polish fashion. So this is already even more what's the word I'm looking for? More trying to get in and influence and shake things up. Right, like Mea Sharim, except then the clothing was not the uniform of religious Jews. It was the opposite. As of 1808, a Jew who cannot read and write either Russian, German, or Polish cannot be elected to municipal councils. By 1812, in order to be appointed to the rabbinate or a communal position, you had to be fluent, you had to be literate in Polish, German, or Russian. This is a chiddush. This is a big innovation. And in order to be appointed as a rabbi or any other communal position, that might be, I don't know if it includes teachers in the schools, shochtim, the people that organize the Jewish community, etc. But you need to be literate in Polish, Russian, or German. Now, this idea, in the second article of the Act, all Jews are divided into 4 classes. Farmers, number 1, farmers. 2, manufacturers and craftsmen. 3, merchants. And 4, city dwellers. Now these merchants, these classes, what class you're assigned to, influences over here. It's not clear exactly how all of these things were enforced. In the end, the statutes of 1804, I mean, Danielle asked the question, how was this enforced? So in places where the rabbi of a town, if his position had to be rubber stamped by the authorities, so he could not attain his position unless he could prove some kind of competency. And there is some evidence that there were places where this was enforced, and other places where it was just simply overlooked. But I think more significantly is the tenor of what the government thought it could be doing or should be doing or ought to be doing. So look here where it says, if a Jew is not registered in one of these classes, the classes mentioned over here, a Jew will not be tolerated anywhere in Russia. So unless you can show that you're a farmer or a manufacturer or doing something productive, so then your right to residency is up for question. And we've mentioned many times in the past the right of residency is the main, it's your lunch ticket. Your right to live in this country is only because the king or the Tsar or whoever it is says you're allowed to live here. And therefore, your dependency, your stability, your whole life, not just your livelihood, is connected to your right of residency. So this idea that we're going to be moving the Jews into these more productive, less exploitative in the eyes of those that kind of gerrymander the situation in which the Jews become the puppets of the real exploiters. So your ability to get with the program and move into one of these professions is what allows you to be tolerated anywhere in Russia. Jews who will not present a written document in standard legal form certifying their membership in a class will be regarded as vagrants and will be treated according to the full severity of the law. Just to go back a second, no Jew will be compelled to engage in agriculture in the aforementioned provinces. We're not going to force you to become a farmer. But those who do shall be exempt from payment of taxes for a period of 10 years. That's a very big incentive. Now, it wasn't just Jews that were given incentives to move into agriculture. Again, Russia is always concerned with how we're going to produce enough food to feed all the mouths here. But if you go into farming, you get 10-year tax exemption. This exemption, however, does not extend to debts related to the purchase of land, they'll be relieved, etc., etc., etc. Hold on for another. Again, in reality, these statutes made little progress. And even though schools were open to Jews, the Russian Jews were, as opposed to what happened, let's say, in Berlin, as opposed to what happened, let's say, in Germany, Jewish society here starts off with a far more traditional orientation. And the Jews were much more skeptical than the Russian Jews, the Polish Jews, were much more skeptical than their German counterparts. And it takes a lot more to convince them to kind of enter modernity. Not everything that was dictated in these statutes was put into effect for various reasons, partially because no matter how centralized the bureaucracy was, you're talking about a huge swath of land, and to try to control life on this level over this amount of land and with this amount of people is a very difficult thing to do. Of course, in 1812, there's one big monkey wrench that gets thrown into the works, and that is, anybody? Extra credit? No? What happens in 1812? So Raphael, you're jumping the gun in terms of the Eastern European Haskalah. We're going to come to that, but the Enlightenment comes later. Yes, Ben and Barbara, the War of, not the War of 1812. The War of 1812 is a war fought between the United States and England. But in 1812, there was a war. As a matter of fact, the 1812 Overture, which sometimes gets, by accident, thought of as having something to do with the War of 1812 between America and England, is written about Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812. That's about the War of 1812. not the War of 1812, that's about the 1812 invasion by Napoleon into Russia. And that kind of certainly throws a monkey wrench into everybody's desire to modernize Russia. It was a very catastrophic war. But ultimately, the government is incapable of implementing these ideas because the Jews simply will not leave the shtetl. And the pull of tradition, the gravity of it, was so much more strong in Eastern European than it was in Western Europe, that everything plays out much differently. Ultimately, the rise of the Haskalah, of the Jewish Enlightenment in Eastern Europe, plays itself out in so many very different ways than it did in the West. Not just that it comes later and more slowly and has less of an impact, but because the two societies are so completely different for reasons which we will begin to explore as we make our way through the history of Eastern European Jewry. This was just by way of introduction. We will continue more next week. I'm putting my email in the box. You also get emails from me. I have 10 different email addresses. They're all the same. They all come to the same address. It doesn't matter. But this is my Gmail address, so you can also chat me by Gmail if you have questions during the week. I will try to post each session's text in advance. Usually what we'll do, similar to the format tonight, we'll give some background, and then usually we'll look at some kind of primary document that enlightens the topic at hand, and I'll post those to the website in advance. You usually get an email notice when something's been uploaded there, and if you have a chance to look over those documents in advance of each session, that probably is helpful. I will stay on the line if anybody has any questions, and if not, I will see you next week. Neil, yes. Do you have Neil? Do you have a microphone? Neil, do you have a microphone?
Hello, can you hear me? Hello.
Hi. Hi.
Hi. Okay. Well, first of all, I just want to say this is the absolute first time I'm trying this, so apologize if there's any protocols I'm breaking. But I just wanted to know. I am interested in this class very much. How can I get hold of the class from the very beginning since I came in late?
Today's class?
Yes.
So very shortly, probably within 20 minutes, the archive will be uploaded to the website.
The website being WebYeshiva.org?
Yeah, in other words, when you log in with your username and password at WebYeshiva.org, you'll be able to then go to your schedule, and you'll click on the Jewish history class, and there'll be a section that says archives.
Okay, got it.
And if you have any trouble at all, you can contact our tech support.
Got it. Okay.
Okay.
Now, just curious, this microphone is always on?
Your microphone?
Yes.
No, it's usually muted. Depending upon how many people are in the class, we can't leave all the microphones open. But if you wanted to speak, you could have just raised. You see on the participants panel, there's a little icon for the raising the hand.
Let me see here.
Or you could have chatted in, and I would have known to open your microphone.
I'll have to look for
above the chat box. You see, it looks like a little hand.
Sure, I'm not sure I can see what you're talking about.
Okay.
I'll find it. It's fine. Oh, I see. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Okay.
Okay. Danielle, you would. Yeah. So click on that. You'll see now it. There you go. You see your hand just went up.
Okay.
So anyway, if you want to speak, then I'm going to mute you now.
Okay, great.
Danielle, you had a question. What do you mean by that? How modern the course gets? Like, what are we going to get up to? Oh, well, we'll get there. We started. We've been. I hope that by the end of the semester we'll get up to Zionism, and then in the spring we'll move forward. But if you stay with us, we'll make it up to the 20th century at least. But over the course of this 10 or 11-week session, I hope to get up through Zionism. Okay. So if anybody else has any questions, if not, we will sign off.